Hi, everybody. This is another podcast where I will try to explain the difference between research designs and research methods, because usually I see that this is a source of confusion among students. At the same time, this could be another guide that you could use in your journey to create your research project. I'll try to explain this in a way that is logical and methodical. Well, that's that word again. So, what is research design? The term design and method are used interchangeably a lot. Here we'll attempt to distinguish them for clarity. I'll also use an example for illustration. The textbook states simply that research design involves devising a strategy for finding out something. Other textbooks state that the research design is the plan or blueprint for a study and includes the who, what, where, when, why, and how of an investigation. This is Hagen 2018. Another definition defines the research design as the overall strategy that you choose to integrate the different components of the study in a coherent and logical way, thereby ensuring you will effectively address the research problem. One thing is clear: the research problem, the research question, determines the type of design that you will use and not the other way around. So you do your literature review and you have a good idea now what your gap is, what the problem is that you want to address, and then you're going to design your study around that problem. This will not be a long and comprehensive video or a lecture, just an overview today, okay? So there's probably going to be many designs that I'm not going to mention. There are basically three types of research design: descriptive, correlational, and experimental. There's the descriptive design, and it basically describes the subject or a phenomenon with words, numbers, tables, graphs, or all of these together. Sometimes it's as simple as here's the mean, the standard deviation, and there's the count of or frequency of how many people we had in each group, and etc. Maybe there's some observation done, and it's basically just detailing out what you saw. You mostly see descriptive studies in a qualitative type of study, and it does not really involve numbers or statistical tests, just descriptions. There's correlational, and a correlational design measures the relationship or association between variables. It basically, what is a relationship between variables, how are they associated, what's the strength of association there, and so on. Then there is experimental, and that's typically the gold standard. This is what you want to do, but most studies, especially if you're working on a dissertation or especially in the criminal justice research, or if you're into social sciences, um, or maybe some of the soft sciences, you're not going to really have an experiment. You'll probably have more of a correlational, maybe even descriptive, but experimental is when the researcher will introduce an event, a treatment, a manipulation of the subjects to investigate a cause and effect relationship. So if you do something to one group but not the other, does it change the outcome and questions like that? This is done mostly in clinical research, where there is a treatment and a control group, and you randomize people in each of the groups, and then you collect the data and run the tests. This is the experimental design, but it does not mean that there are no experiments in criminal justice. There could be intervention for measuring outcomes of prisoners' recidivism, for example, foot patrol experimental designs, etc. All of the designs can be split in basically two groups or research categories: qualitative designs and quantitative designs. The term design, after qualitative and quantitative, is not really design, but more of a method of inquiry about your research problem. And in these two groups, design and method are used interchangeably. The big difference between the two is how we're going to set up our study. Are we going to ask a lot of questions, or are we going to collect data and do calculation and statistical tests? So in the qualitative designs, they are often used to address the why questions. because why means you're going to ask a little bit deeper. You're going to get through thoughts of people. You're going to get ideas. Um, and maybe you do some interviews or you're going to uncover some opinions. Some common methods of qualitative designs include focus groups, qualitative individual interviews, field observations, where you go out in the field and you do some observation and you take some field notes and so on. So try to learn more about these methods if you have already decided on a qualitative design for your research project. Data is usually comprised of interview responses or themes from field notes. So it's these long narratives, okay? Not a lot of statistics are involved here. Then there's quantitative designs, and they're used to quantify the problem through operationalization of concepts into variables, and you will collect your numerical data, or you will collect maybe some secondary data, and you transform it into numbers so that you can run some actual statistical tests. Quantitative data collections methods include all the fun things that the statisticians love and we in CRJ 716 love. So we would use some surveys, maybe short question interviews, big, huge data sets, longitudinal studies, sometimes systematic tests and measurements. So here's a very short list of some types of research designs grouped into the big two categories, qualitative and quantitative design types. Think of research design mostly as the logic and the methods as the logistics as your tools and how you're going to complete it. Let's use an example of a very simple study in hopes that we will understand the design and methods better. I'm going to stick with the same idea that I mentioned in a podcast before, that we were interested in understanding the relationship between immigration status and arrest for assault in New York City. So our research question will define the choices of design and all of our next steps. Let's see how our research question fares in each of the design types. Let's start with the descriptive design. If we're going to do a descriptive design for our immigrants research question, perhaps we can do a qualitative kind of method and we want to get in depth information on why people in different immigration status in New York City get arrested for assault and some don't. In a correlational design, we would ask if there is a association between different immigration statuses and arrest for assault, and if there's really something going on there. Experimental design would be asking, does being in a particular immigration status affect the number of arrests for assault over other statuses? We would be chasing a cause and effect type of relationship here with experimental designs. Perhaps after immigrants naturalize, they are prone to more assault and arrest because they know now that they are US citizens, so they can get deported for these types of offenses. So perhaps being in any other status was somewhat a deterrent before for criminal behavior and things like that. So the first thing we do is pose hypotheses. Okay, so before we have defined hypotheses as specific statements about the relationship between two or more variables. There are many other definitions depending on the preference of different authors. Another definition is that a hypothesis is a specific expectation about empirical reality derived from propositions. I usually prefer a more direct approach to any definition because any definition that contains other terms that themselves need to be defined makes it so much harder to understand. So we'll go with the first simpler definition, that hypothesis is the specification of the relationship between two or more variables. Now that we have the research problem, question, or hypothesis, which is the relationship between immigration status and arrest for assault, now you're going to need two hypotheses. One is the null, and the other is the alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis means that null means no effect, right? Nothing, or so there's nothing happening between the variables here. Okay, I think many of you ask in general, why do we need this? This is not natural. What is this null hypothesis and what does it serve? So I think that's a fair question. The null is an abstract, fictitious concept, our creation. What we want to know is what human nature usually wants to know, the differences between people or things. So why do we create a fictional concept, such as the null, which all it does is that it states that there is no difference, the opposite of what we wanted to know. So we create this as a workaround to get answers about what we want to know, which we can't get right away. So we create the null and test it in hopes that uh, we're going to reject it. Okay, because it is easier to reject the null hypothesis than to find out that the research question is true. It is easier to test the null because out of all possibilities, okay, there is only one where things are equal, where nothing is happening in this reality, and there is an infinity where they are different. And if we reject the null, it automatically means that we reject the no relationship or no difference proposition. So we accept the idea that there is something happening here, which we wanted to prove in the first place. Let's go to alternative hypothesis. This is the opposite of null, and it is the statement that matches our research question, what we want the study to show. The alternative should complement the null. So both the null and alternative hypothesis should make up 100% of all possibilities out there. An example it could be that if your null is that the mean weight is 150 pounds, the alternative should be that the mean weight is not 150 pounds. It doesn't matter if it's more or less. If the alternative states that the mean weight is greater than 150 pounds, it does not capture the universe of possibilities where the mean could be less than 150 pounds. So let's start with the descriptive research. This is mostly your qualitative study. You can use it in a quantitative study as well, but typically descriptive is generally associated with a qualitative design. Here we're trying to get that depth of meaning. We're trying to dig down deep into understanding of what is going on between arrests for assault among immigration status in immigrant communities. Why do some get arrested more for assault than others? So it consists of only the research question, no hypothesis, and it's because it's descriptive and we're not testing anything. Our research question, for example, can be quantitative, since we would ask what proportion of immigrants in a different status category commit assaults and are arrested for it. You'd get the data, count the aggregates, and then compare them and probably control for other variables such as marital status, because maybe those who are married um, are less likely to commit the offense and get arrested for it. Controlled for age, are younger people more prone to this type of offense, etc. Perhaps if you see that one group of immigrants have a very high proportion of arrests for assault, you may then want to conduct a qualitative study. Go out and do a field research, qualitative interviews, for example, create open-ended questions to kind of get a deeper understanding of what's going on with your research problem. Next is correlational. Our immigration study is probably a correlational design, and this is the most you can do and probably the best course of action, because here you test the differences. After we decide what to do with the null, reject or fail to reject it, then we will need to formulate a conclusion about the alternative hypothesis and derivatively the answer to the initial research question. Let's talk next about hypotheses in experimental design. We have mentioned this type briefly in a previous podcast and looked at an intervention among prisoners where some were assigned to complete the sentence in community homes, and the control group remained in normal prison conditions. Then we compared and tested the recidivism rates of both groups after a period of time after release. So in our immigration example, which we said it is most likely a correlational design, we might find that there is a significant difference in the number of arrests for assault among our immigrants of different statuses. But we do not know what causes this difference. How can we show that the immigration status one has really causes more or less arrests for assault? If we want to know the cause, we need to do an experimental design, the third type of design we mentioned before, which is the only one type of design that can demonstrate cause and effect. We need to create a manipulation, an event, and then introduce participants to it and measure the outcome after the event and compare with the measure taken prior to the manipulation event. Internal validity is at the experiment's core. If a manipulation is performed, then the outcome happens. And if a manipulation is not performed, then the outcome does not happen. In our example, if we create a type of event that you introduce to immigrants of different status in order to manipulate their behavior so that it might affect assault and arrest for that offense, I would think of naturalization. In this case, would only start with non-citizen statuses. The process of naturalization would turn the non-citizens into citizens. So our hypothesis would be, null hypothesis is that naturalization has no statistically significant effect in the number of arrests for assault between non-citizens and naturalized citizens in New York City. Or the null hypothesis can be phrased like this. There is no statistically significant difference in the number of arrests for assault between non-citizens and naturalized citizens in New York City. You can phrase hypotheses in many different ways. Only your imagination is the limit to how you can articulate outstanding hypotheses. The alternative hypothesis here would be that there is a statistically significant difference in the number of arrests for assault between non-citizens and naturalized citizens in New York City. Observe that this hypothesis that I created, the alternative hypothesis, is a two-tailed hypothesis. Now that we have our research question and testable hypotheses, we're going to go from our logic to our logistic, from design to methods. One analogy I can offer is to use the chess game. For those of you who play chess, a design would be one of the known theoretical systems, such as London system or King's Gambit, for example. So you would know that these systems are the ones you will use when playing white pieces, because you know from your own experience and from what other players have played and have observed that these are good systems and get good results. So this is the blueprint you have prior to starting the game. Of course, you do need to know how to move the pieces. For example, the pawn goes to certain boxes and certain pieces move in a known box, etc. These are the methods that you're going to use to follow your design. For example, in the London opening, the design is shown in the image. That is the idea, the blueprint of what we have in mind to play as white. But in order to implement this idea, we have to know how to move the pieces, what pieces to move and where. This is shown in the video. So generally, these are the movements. So these can be the methods. The same goes for the King's Gambit chess opening. So in the image, you'll see the design. This is the idea. Okay, the pawns move forward, and the video shows the method, how they move, and how the opponent moves. Okay, so now we have a sort of understanding of what the design is, the general idea, the blueprint, the plan, and the method is what makes it work. What are the steps? What are the tools to make the design work? Now let's talk about some moving pieces of research methods. The question remains, how exactly will I answer my research problem or question? Logistics, right? That's where the method part starts. As if design and methods were not confusing enough, we find another term very often used, research methodology, which is the concept, the philosophy, and the justification behind your research. However, we are here mostly concerned with the methods, the tools, and the techniques used to conduct research. The research methods include all of the materials and work we need to build from that blueprint. Assuming we are going to use an experimental design, we start with two groups. The treatment group, which will be the non-citizens who go through the treatment, in other words, through the naturalization process, and the control group, which is all of those who are non-citizens not yet naturalized. The treatment group and the control group are the cornerstones of an experimental design. Let's also look at some methods for our example. How do we choose samples since we cannot analyze the entire population? The participants would be selected randomly based on some immigration databases cross-checked with police records, and they all would have been arrested one or more times for assault. The sample will exclude the US citizens born in the United States. The sample can be a simple random sampling chosen from the list acquired from those two databases. We have to look at whether there are ethical issues with our research method in the way participants are selected, treated, whether there are problems with anonymity and confidentiality, etc. I can envision a few issues to resolve in order to get this experiment up and running, including immigration staff who are going to determine and approve naturalization application for participants in this experiment, whether they should know that the applicants are participants in this study or not, so that may be an issue with bias and a myriad of other things. We will also need to look at any threats to internal and external validity, which can be possible sources of false conclusion about cause and measurement. How do we measure our variables? We're going to measure the number of arrests for assault for non-citizens and for newly naturalized citizens during a certain period of time, say 1 or 2 years, and compare them with the previous number of assault arrests prior to being a US citizen and see if the treatment, that is naturalization, caused a change in the number of arrests for assault, be that either decrease or increase. Another way to do this is to get the same non-citizen participants, measure their number of arrests for assault, and then remeasure that number after they become US citizens and compare to see if there was an effect from naturalization. This is longitudinal study. We need to identify the level of measurement of each variable in order to produce the correct statistical test later on. The number of arrests is a ratio level measurement variable, while the immigration status would be an ordinal variable. If the immigration status would have only two categories, non-citizen and citizen, then you would need to code them such as 1 non-citizen and 2 citizen, etc. This is where knowledge of variable types and level of measurement come in handy. We also need to identify which one is the causal variable or the independent variable, and which is the effect or the dependent variable. The predictor is the immigration status, and the dependent variable is the number of arrests for assault, because the relationship we are attempting to study looks at the effect that immigration status has on the outcome, the arrests. Of course, you would need to control for different other variables to exclude other factors that might have contributed in the observed effect, say decrease in the number of arrests for assault other than the event of naturalization. This video would be much, much longer if we get into all the nuts and bolts of each aspect of the methods, but it is not to say that you shouldn't include them in your research proposal. Next step is data collection. When the experiment ends, we collect the relevant and necessary data and clean them up. If we produce our own data from surveys, experimental data, etc., this is called primary data. If we get data from others, from agency records, this is secondary data. In our example, we'd collect secondary data. As I said in the previous slide, we need to code all categorical variables and make the data ready for analysis. What kind of analysis would do? To test our hypothesis, we would conduct appropriate statistical tests where all statistical assumptions have been met. In a previous podcast, I demonstrated a one-way ANOVA test because the independent variable had 3 or more categories. In our current hypothetical case, when the predictor has only 2 groups, non-citizen and citizen, we will have to conduct an independent samples t-test. Say that after conducting the statistical analysis, we'd find that naturalized citizens were arrested for assault at a much lower rate than non-citizens, and eliminating or controlling for other variables, we figure out that naturalization explains a significantly large variation in the reduction of arrests for assault. Then we determine that naturalization, becoming a US citizen, was the real cause for the arrest decline in immigrant communities in New York City. We can also state that since the design was randomized trial, experiment, and controlled, we can potentially generalize our findings to similar immigrants in other cities or areas in the United States. In more specific terms, we reject the null hypothesis that there was no difference and concluded that the difference not only existed, but it was statistically significant. So, one other implication of this generalized study would be policy-wise. Does this mean that to decrease this type of arrests, federal immigration authorities can help local communities by increasing the number of naturalizations? That is something that needs to be looked at further. But just keep in mind that this is only a hypothetical example, okay? But it goes to show that you can use research to influence public policy. So this is the end of this presentation. I hope that this was helpful for clearing up any possible confusion about research methods and design and how to use them in your research paper. Thanks for watching the whole podcast. See you soon.